The freezing air tasted like burnt oil and fear. Sergeant Rusty Kincaid gripped the twin .50 caliber handles in the chin turret of the Memphis Belle II, his gaze straining against the blinding February glare high above the hostile plains of central Germany. It was the winter of 1944, and every man in the 8th Air Force knew they were playing a lethal game of attrition, a game they felt in their bones they were losing. The flak was thicker now, rising up in black, malevolent puffs that looked like cosmic bruises blooming across the sapphire sky. This wasn't a standard milk run. This was the beginning of Operation Argument, what the crews morbidly dubbed Big Week, and the sheer weight of the mission hung in the cockpit like the fog from a breached oxygen line. The bombers, hundreds of them, stretched out in vast, agonizingly slow combat boxes, moving deeper into the Reich than ever before. For months, the American doctrine, "the bomber will always get through," had been tested to the point of breaking. They had been chewed up over Schweinfurt, battered over Bremen, and every mission meant a 20% chance of never seeing England again. The German fighters, the formidable Focke-Wulf 190s and nimble Messerschmitt 109s, were like relentless, angry wasps, hitting them with increasing sophistication and lethal force, often equipped with rockets capable of shattering a flying fortress in a single fiery blow. The losses were astronomical, unsustainable, and the morale was cracking. As Rusty adjusted his goggles, he saw a flash of silver far off to the 10 o'clock high position. Not the comforting silhouette of a P-47 Thunderbolt, but a tight formation of black-nosed 190s peeling off for an attack run. Fear was a cold knot in his stomach, but beneath the fear was a profound, troubling question that permeated every pre-mission briefing. How long could they keep this up? Was their bravery just delaying the inevitable? The Luftwaffe was inflicting massive casualties, yet the orders kept coming. Press the attack, hit the vital heart of German industry. The Americans were relying on sheer industrial output and unwavering courage, but it felt like a bloody, Pyrrhic exchange. Today, however, something was different. The silence, initially, was the most unsettling part. Usually, by this point deep over Kassel or Frankfurt, the sky would already be a maelstrom of contrails and exploding ordnance. Today there was only the rhythmic thrum of the 4 Wright Cyclone engines and the crackle of static in the intercom. It felt like the calm before the end of the world. They were carrying extra fuel, extra bombs, and an almost unbearable burden of hope. If they failed this week, if the cost became too high, the entire strategic bombing campaign might be stalled, granting the Reich vital months to perfect their jet programs and fundamentally shift the balance of the air war. They needed a miracle. Or perhaps they needed to deploy a weapon so overwhelmingly superior, so decisively game-changing that the Germans would justly accuse them of cheating against the ancient, honorable rules of warfare. That weapon was already thousands of feet above them, hidden in the blinding sun, waiting for the trap to be sprung. The German High Command, specifically Hermann Goering, had made a critical, fatal miscalculation. They believed the Americans were tactically exhausted, stretched thin, and fundamentally incapable of mounting a coordinated deep penetration offensive targeting their most critical asset, the factories that built their fighters. Intelligence reports, often filtered through wishful thinking and exaggerated combat claims, suggested that U.S. fighter escorts simply did not possess the endurance to remain over the key industrial targets, the assembly plants at Regensburg, Leipzig, and Schweinfurt, for the duration required. They were counting on the natural limitations of the P-47 Thunderbolt's range. The Luftwaffe strategy was simple, if desperate. Hold back the majority of their front-line Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulfs 190s until the escort fighters reached their mandatory turning point, the point of no return, where fuel dictated a retreat. Then, and only then, would the German reserves, the Zerstörer heavy fighters, the rocket-equipped interceptors, and the newly trained fresh pilots be unleashed upon the unescorted flying fortresses and liberators. It was a strategy based on geometry and fuel mathematics, a calculated sacrifice that Goering believed would bleed the 8th Air Force dry. What the Germans did not account for was the quiet revolution brewing on the English airfields of East Anglia. The weapon that was changing everything wasn't a new bomb sight or an impenetrable armor plating. It was the North American P-51 Mustang. It had been flying since 1940, initially suffering from poor high-altitude performance with its original Allison engine. But when the genius of the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was mated to the Mustang's perfect laminar flow wing design, the P-51 BC model was born. Suddenly, the Americans possessed a fighter that could fly higher, faster, and crucially, farther than anything the Luftwaffe had. With drop tanks, the Mustang could fly from England to Berlin and back, escorting the bombers all the way to the target and remaining to fight over the target area. General Karl Spaatz and General Jimmy Doolittle understood this shift perfectly. The goal of Operation Argument was no longer merely to bomb infrastructure. The primary, non-negotiable objective was the eradication of the Luftwaffe. Doolittle issued the legendary order: "The destruction of enemy fighters and their production facilities is paramount. If the fighters draw you away from the bomber formation, go get them. Follow them to the ground if you must." This was a declaration of war on the German fighter force itself, a decision to trade infrastructure damage for air superiority. The American crews preparing for Big Week felt this shift. It wasn't just a bombing run, it was the largest aerial gladiatorial contest ever conceived, designed not merely to win a battle, but to win the entire sky, permanently. The Mustangs, painted silver and sleek, were the executioners, poised to deliver the decisive blow that would make every subsequent bombing run a mere formality. The stage was set for a confrontation where one side was playing by the old rules of limited range, and the other was about to redefine the entire chessboard. Dawn broke over the damp fields of East Anglia on February 20th, 1944, a sight of incredible, terrifying majesty. The scale of the mobilization was unprecedented. Over 1,000 heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, roared into life, their engines coughing thick white smoke into the cold morning air. They were accompanied by nearly 900 escort fighters, a mix of P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and most critically, the newly numerous P-51 Mustangs, now organized into powerful fighter groups tasked with deep penetration. The sky became a vast, undulating river of aluminum and noise. Rusty Kincaid's B-17, part of the main force heading toward the aircraft assembly plants near Leipzig, felt like a tiny, vibrating speck in this overwhelming armada. The sheer number was meant to be a psychological blow, a visible demonstration of American industrial power, but it also made them a spectacularly tempting target. The first skirmishes began over the Dutch coast. The P-47s, robust and powerful, engaged the initial German screening force, pushing them back effectively. The Thunderbolts were magnificent short-range protectors, drawing the Germans into high-energy fights that favored the P-47's dive speed and durability. For the bomber crews, the sight was reassuring, a temporary reprieve. But the veterans knew the true danger lay hundreds of miles further east, where the P-47s would inevitably peel off, flashing their wings in a solemn, silent farewell. As they crossed the Rhine, the flak intensity ratcheted up exponentially. It was coordinated, intelligent, and brutal, exploding so close that the concussion shook the massive bombers violently, throwing men against their harnesses. The noise inside the B-17 became a continuous, high-pitched shriek as shrapnel tore through the aluminum skin. The first casualties were from flak, not fighters. A B-17 in the low box of Rusty's formation took a direct hit in the wing root. The entire wing folded upward instantly, and the bomber tumbled end over end, already engulfed in flames, a dozen men trapped inside. The sight was immediate, shocking, and a stark reminder that even with hundreds of protectors, the laws of physics and probability were always against them. The German ground controllers were tracking them with chilling accuracy, vectoring their dwindling fighter reserves to meet them at the point of maximum exposure. The crucial moment arrived as they passed the halfway point over central Germany. Rusty watched anxiously as the P-47s, their external tanks nearly dry, waved their goodbyes and turned west. The sky immediately felt larger, emptier, and infinitely more hostile. This was the moment the German pilots had been waiting for, the moment they could commit their full, desperate power against the soft, vulnerable underbelly of the American air superiority myth. From the hazy horizon they came, dozens, then scores of the deadly German interceptors, rising up from their hidden airfields, fueled by desperation and national pride, ready to make the Americans bleed for every meter of airspace. The vacuum left by the departing P-47s was filled almost instantly by the screaming urgency of the incoming German attack. Lieutenant Klaus Richter, flying a heavily armed Focke-Wulf 190, was exhilarated. He had been held back at a distant satellite field, conserving fuel and morale, waiting for this exact, predictable window of vulnerability. Below him, the bomber stream looked like a monstrous, slow-moving slug, utterly helpless without its short-legged escorts. Richter knew the tactical geometry by heart. The Thunderbolts could not reach this far. This was the Reich's chance. They were flying the classic high-side attack, coming in above and behind the lead combat box, intending to punch through the tail gunners' meager defenses and unleash a hail of cannon fire and rockets into the B-17's fuel tanks and bomb bays. Richter saw the lead bomber perfectly framed in his gun sight, and his thumb tightened on the firing stud. The air around the bomber formation erupted in a chaotic ballet of tracer fire, every .50 caliber gun in the American formations chattering a desperate song of defense. Rusty Kincaid, suddenly overwhelmed by targets, was swinging his turret frantically, his hands burning from the recoil. He could taste the cordite. The sheer density of the incoming fighters was unlike anything they had faced since Schweinfurt. They came in waves, fearless and aggressive, exploiting the gap in the American defense. One FW-19 came too close, ripping through the tail section of a neighboring fortress, which immediately began to trail thick, oily black smoke. Men started bailing out, tiny black specks against the vastness, before the plane pitched violently and exploded. The American crews were fighting for their lives, emptying thousands of rounds, but the German pilots, knowing this was their last viable defense line before their factories were annihilated, pressed their attack with suicidal zeal. They had the element of surprise and the advantage of position. For 15 agonizing minutes, the sky was a charnel house. It was a pure slugging match, with the B-17s trading armor and firepower for speed and maneuverability. Richter felt a surge of triumph as his wingman scored a hit, sending a B-24 spiraling down. The American gamble, he thought, had failed. They had risked everything on a single massive penetration, and now they were exposed, vulnerable, and doomed to be picked apart piecemeal, hundreds of miles from safety. This was not war, this was execution. He banked sharply, preparing for his second pass, focusing on the sheer amount of damage he could inflict before the bombers reached their target, hoping to scatter the formation and break their defensive integrity. He looked up, checking the high altitude, ensuring the sky remained clear of unwanted interference, specifically those cursed sleek American fighters. He saw nothing but the high, pale blue of the stratosphere, confirming their operational intelligence. The escorts were gone. The battlefield was theirs. But as he rolled out of his turn, poised to dive back into the swirling chaos of the bombers, a single, sharp voice crackled over his RT radio, thick with panic and disbelief. "Achtung! Silberfische! They are everywhere! High sun! High sun!" Richter didn't understand. Silberfische, silverfish, was their slang for the U.S. escorts. But they couldn't be here. It defied physics. He looked up one last time, squinting against the blinding winter sun. And then he saw them, dozens of them, sleek, silver, and utterly unexpected. They were higher than the German interceptors, positioned perfectly, diving down like avenging angels. The appearance of the Mustangs was less a gradual arrival and more a cataclysmic, instantaneous reversal of fortune. They materialized out of the sun, utilizing the perfect height and speed advantage that their Rolls-Royce Merlin engines and long-range tanks provided. To the German pilots, they were ghosts, fighters that simply shouldn't possess the operational radius to be this far east. Leutnant Richter, mid-dive toward the B-17s, suddenly found his world inverted. He was no longer the hunter, he was the prey. The Mustangs, led by men like Colonel Don Gentile and Major John Meyer, weren't flying defensive patterns around the bombers. They were diving into the mass of the attacking Luftwaffe with surgical, devastating aggression. This was the moment General Doolittle's radical new directive was enacted. Prioritize the destruction of the enemy fighter. The P-51 pilots ignored the Flak and focused solely on the Germans attacking the bomber stream. The sky turned into a one-sided slaughterhouse. The Mustang, with its superior speed at altitude and its incredible maneuverability, dominated the heavier, slower Focke-Wulf 190s and the standard-issue Messerschmitt 109s. The Germans were fighting a close-range dogfight battle, but the Mustangs controlled the vertical axis, using the element of surprise and sustained speed. Richter felt the sudden presence of a P-51 on his 6, the roar of its Merlin engine a chilling sound that cut through the noise of battle. He jammed the stick forward, trying to break the lock, throwing his FW-190 into a desperate high-G spiral. But the Mustang pilot was glued to him. The chatter of 6.5 caliber machine guns opened up, a torrent of metal that tore into the wing of Richter's plane. The Focke-Wulf lurched violently, control surfaces gone, and smoke poured from the engine cowling. Richter punched the canopy release, barely escaping before his fighter disintegrated. Looking down as he fell, swinging beneath the parachute silk, he saw the carnage. Dozens of white trails descending, indicating German pilots bailing out, and plumes of black smoke marking the graves of those who hadn't made it. The sheer density of the American escort was overwhelming. It wasn't just a few fighters, it was whole groups, fresh, fueled and deadly, replacing the short-legged P-47s exactly when the Germans had expected their moment of victory. This was the moment the American air doctrine achieved its impossible goal: total air superiority over the enemy's heartland. The battle wasn't an even contest. It was an ambush facilitated by superior engineering and relentless industrial output. Was America cheating? If air warfare was about balancing range and firepower, then yes, the P-51 felt like a cheat code inserted into the battlefield, defying the geographical limit that had defined the war to that point. The look of utter despair on the faces of the German prisoners captured later reflected this realization. They weren't fighting brave bomber crews anymore. They were fighting an economic superpower that had deployed a perfect weapon at the perfect time. Now, seeing how this decisive moment of superiority completely altered the balance of power and sealed the fate of the Luftwaffe, I have to ask you, in the intense, high-stakes environment of total war, where technological surprise is the ultimate weapon, does using a resource advantage like the long-range P-51 Mustang cross a moral or ethical line? Or is it simply a necessary, cold calculation for victory? Share your thoughts below on where the line lies between superior technology and unfair advantage in a global conflict. The air battle raged for another 30 minutes, but the outcome was already determined. The German fighter forces, which had been carefully husbanded and deployed based on faulty intelligence regarding the American escort capabilities, were decimated. The Mustang pilots, many of them young, aggressive, and highly trained, were flying with an almost predatory focus. They weren't just protecting the bombers, they were actively hunting. They flew sweeping patrols up to 20,000 feet above the bomber stream, using the altitude advantage to spot enemy reserves climbing from their airfields, and then diving upon them with blinding speed. Major Meyer's group alone claimed over 20 German fighters in the space of one frantic hour. The pilots of the Memphis Belle II, including Rusty Kincaid, watched the extraordinary reversal unfold. Instead of the frantic close-quarters defense they had endured over the past year, they were now spectators to a brutal, systematic dismantling of the enemy's air force. The P-51s were everywhere, chasing the FW-190s down through the cloud layers, sometimes following them low into the deck, ignoring the flak to confirm the kill, fulfilling Doolittle's mandate to the letter. This was a radical shift in philosophy. Previously, escort fighters stayed glued to the bombers, engaging defensively. Now they were unleashed predators, forcing the Luftwaffe to fight on American terms. For the Germans, it was a profound trauma. Their training doctrine centered on engaging the bombers directly. Fighting aggressive, high-speed, long-range American fighters over their own territory was a disaster for which they were psychologically and tactically unprepared. Many German pilots, low on fuel and desperate, attempted high-speed escapes, only to find the Mustangs could match them and often outpace them in a dive. The combination of the Mustang's superior altitude performance, thanks to the two-stage, two-speed supercharger of the Merlin engine, and its exceptionally clean aerodynamic design, meant that in a high-speed chase, the American plane almost always held the advantage. The combat box of B-17s, though still taking punishing hits from Flak and the few remaining desperate German attackers, now felt an astonishing sense of security. The overwhelming sound of combat shifted from the close thwack of cannon fire impacting their fuselage to the distant, high-pitched shriek of dogfights playing out on the perimeter of their formation. Rusty glanced toward his pilot, Captain Miller, whose face was usually etched with tension during the long bombing runs. Today, Miller allowed a grim smile. The relief was palpable, profound, and deeply satisfying. This wasn't just survival, this was dominance. This single deployment of long-range escort fighters had fundamentally altered the tactical risk equation for the entire mission. The heavy bombers, which were the irreplaceable tip of the spear of the 8th Air Force, were finally achieving the level of protection required to sustain the strategic bombing campaign without incurring unacceptable losses. The cost for the Luftwaffe this day would be crippling, not just in lost planes, but in lost faith in their ability to defend the Reich. While the air battle was reaching its fever pitch, the core mission had to be completed. The B-17s arrived over their targets, the crucial aircraft assembly plants near Leipzig and the massive bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The ground below was a maze of industrial sprawl, smokestacks, and heavily defended targets. The visibility was surprisingly good, a cruel twist of fate for the Germans who had hoped for cloud cover. Captain Miller guided the Memphis Belle II into the final bombing run, the target flashing up in the Norden bomb site. The Flak intensity, though momentarily forgotten during the chaotic fighter engagements, returned with renewed vengeance, concentrating on the slow-moving bombers during the straight and level run required for precision bombing. The aircraft bucked and swayed, hit by multiple near misses. One piece of shrapnel ripped through the radio compartment, narrowly missing the operator, leaving a jagged, gaping hole. The tension inside the plane ratcheted back up, forcing the crews to refocus on the immediate tangible danger emanating from the ground. They were so close now, sacrificing every ounce of safety to deliver the payload. The mission called for pinpoint accuracy. They weren't aiming for the city, but for the specific jigs, presses, and assembly lines that built the Focke-Wulf 190. Destruction here would not just stop production, it would set it back for months, creating a critical shortage of German interceptors just as the invasion of Europe was being finalized. The bomb doors opened with a deafening hydraulic whine, exposing the clustered payload to the whistling wind. Rusty, bracing himself in the chin turret, watched the ground rushing up toward them, the intricate pattern of defense mechanisms clearly visible. Then came the familiar, stomach-lurching sensation as the bombs dropped away. The fortress leapt upward, suddenly lighter, faster. Miller immediately threw the plane into evasive maneuvers, banking sharply away from the target zone. Seconds later, below them, the targeted factories erupted in towering columns of smoke and fire. Secondary explosions rippled outwards as caches of fuel, ordnance, and finished aircraft caught fire. The visual proof of their success was immediate and profound. But the retreat was just as perilous as the attack. They were now deep behind enemy lines, having expended much of their ammunition and fuel, and the remaining German fighters, though few in number, were flying with the suicidal desperation of cornered animals. The Mustangs, however, were still there. They formed tight protective rings around the bomber boxes, utilizing the fuel saved by their efficient engines and large drop tanks. The German strategy had depended entirely on the bombers becoming unescorted. The presence of the P-51s acting as vigilant bodyguards neutralized the entire defensive concept. The sight of a silver P-51, wings flashing, chasing off a lone daring MiG-109 still trying to sneak through the defense, was the most beautiful, comforting sight in the world to the exhausted, freezing bomber crews. They had survived the penetration, they had hit the target, and now they had the escort they always dreamed of. An escort that was not only protecting them, but annihilating the enemy's ability to fight in the future. The cost of Big Week, even with the overwhelming superiority provided by the Mustang, was terrible. The 8th Air Force lost 226 heavy bombers and 28 fighters during the week-long offensive. It was a staggering sacrifice, proof that even the most meticulous planning and decisive technological advantage could not make war bloodless. Rusty Kincaid's B-17 returned to its base at Dinenthorpe, battered, scarred, and smelling heavily of ozone and fear. One engine was running rough. The fuselage was riddled with flak and bullet holes, and the waist gunner had suffered a minor injury from shrapnel. As they landed, the crews were immediately swamped by ground personnel, their faces etched with anxious relief. But the losses, though grievous, paled in comparison to the damage inflicted upon the Luftwaffe. The systematic destruction of fighter production facilities, combined with the unprecedented slaughter of experienced German pilots, delivered a catastrophic blow from which the German Air Force would never recover. Over the course of Operation Argument, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 300 pilots killed and over 100 experienced personnel wounded. More critically, they lost approximately 600 fighter aircraft, both in the air and on the ground in the targeted factories. This wasn't merely a statistic. This was the complete decapitation of their combat capacity. Experienced German pilots were a resource that could not be replaced. The American industrial complex, by contrast, could churn out P-51s and B-17s at a rate that dwarfed anything the Germans could muster, especially now that their factories were crippled. The disparity was simple. The U.S. was trading metal for the enemy's men and morale. This disproportionate exchange was the cheating element the title referred to. It wasn't about deception. It was about the crushing, overwhelming reality of total industrial war. The American strategy, validated by the success of Big Week, shifted permanently. Fighter pilots were no longer seen solely as escorts. They were prioritized as offensive hunters. The mission became search and destroy. The Mustang pilots were given free rein to engage the enemy wherever they found them, turning the skies over Germany into a free fire zone for Allied air power. For the pilots of the Luftwaffe who survived Big Week, the psychological defeat was absolute. They were forced to face the reality that they could no longer choose the terms of engagement. The sky, once their homeland, now belonged to the sleek, silvery P-51s that seemed to possess infinite fuel and uncanny speed. The promise of the jet-powered Me-262 was still months away, and by then, the Allied mastery of the skies would be so complete that introducing new weapons would be nearly impossible under the relentless bombing. The air war over Europe was, effectively, over. The strategic implications were profound. The pathway for the D-Day invasion was now clear. There would be no meaningful Luftwaffe intervention over the beaches of Normandy. The ground invasion would be supported by a tactical air force that had already annihilated its opposition.
a victory won high above the clouds of central Germany.
The aftermath of Operation Argument saw the immediate and permanent decline of the Luftwaffe as a major strategic force. Before Big Week, German fighters had been the single largest deterrent to the U.S. bomber force, ensuring that the cost of penetration was always borderline suicidal. After Big Week, the situation reversed entirely. The American strategy evolved from defensive escort to offensive sweep. Mustang pilots, realizing their overwhelming advantage, began to adopt the aggressive tactic of flying far ahead of the bomber stream, actively seeking out and destroying the Luftwaffe reserves before they could even attempt an interception. This became known as Mustang country, a deadly, silent zone thousands of feet up where German pilots feared to tread. The few remaining veteran German aces were pulled back to desperately train the flood of ill-prepared, young pilots now being rushed through the system. These new pilots, with minimal flight time and almost no combat experience, were thrown into the inferno against seasoned American veterans, flying the most advanced piston-engine fighter in the world. The results were predictable and tragic for the Germans. Massacres, not dogfights. The American dominance wasn't merely about the P-51's technological superiority. It was about the cascading failures it triggered in the German system. The destruction of the assembly plants meant fewer planes. The decimation of the veteran pilots meant poor instruction and poor tactical execution. And the sustained air superiority meant the German economy could not recover, leading to a shortage of fuel and spare parts. It was a vicious cycle of defeat. Rusty Kincaid and his crew experienced the dramatic change firsthand on their subsequent missions. While the Flak remained a deadly menace, the aerial opposition diminished drastically. They still saw German fighters, but they were often flying defensively, making timid passes or simply trying to get away from the predatory Mustangs. The fear of the unescorted run, the terror that defined the early days of the bombing campaign, vanished. It was replaced by an almost arrogant certainty of protection. The bomber crews could now focus entirely on target acquisition and bombing accuracy, knowing that the Silberfische above them had neutralized the threat from the air. This new environment fundamentally changed the character of the air war. It shifted the moral balance. For the Germans, it became a fight for existence, throwing poorly trained teenagers into advanced fighters they barely knew how to fly. For the Americans, it evolved into a mission of attrition and execution, driven by the industrial engine that made their air power truly unstoppable. The question of whether it was cheating dissolved into the realization that war is simply the application of overwhelming resources, and in 1944, the United States possessed those resources in abundance, delivering them high over the Reich on the wings of the P-51 Mustang.
The psychological effect of the P-51's unstoppable presence was arguably more damaging than the physical destruction. For the Americans, the sight of the Mustangs flying escort all the way to Berlin and back instilled an unbreakable confidence, transforming the 8th Air Force from a struggling, battered command into the master of the European skies. For the German people, who had been promised absolute protection by Göring's boastful Luftwaffe, the sight of massive bomber formations passing unhindered deep into the fatherland was a devastating symbol of their government's failure. The war was literally brought home in the form of falling bombs, and there was nothing the vaunted Reichsluftverteidigung could do about it. Senior German commanders, including Field Marshal Erhard Milch, recognized the severity of the crisis immediately following Big Week. Internal reports painted a picture of utter disaster, acknowledging that the loss rates of pilots and planes were unsustainable. They realized that the strategic goals of the American campaign, air superiority as a prerequisite for ground invasion, had been met. They understood that the P-51 was the linchpin of this transformation, a weapon of industrial brilliance that countered every defensive tactic they had developed. The German response was frantic, involving dispersal of production facilities and the accelerated development of revolutionary aircraft like the Me-262 jet fighter. But these efforts were too little, too late, and were immediately targeted by the relentless P-51 sweeps. The Mustang pilots, now free from the rigid adherence to the bomber formation, used their range to hunt German airfields, strafing planes on the ground, destroying vital repair infrastructure, and disrupting the distribution of fuel and parts. This phase of the air war became known as the Fighter Pilots' War, characterized by audacious, low-level attacks that eliminated the Luftwaffe's ability to recover. Rusty Kincaid's B-17 crew, now flying missions into late spring 1944, often spent the entire flight without seeing a single enemy interceptor. Instead, they watched the silver streaks of the Mustangs, diving and climbing thousands of feet away, cleaning the skies for them. The fear of being shot down by a fighter had been largely replaced by the constant grinding anxiety of the Flak, which remained deadly until the very end of the war. But the knowledge that if they did encounter an Me-109, a P-51 was likely minutes, if not seconds away, was the greatest comfort they had. This decisive superiority won during Operation Argument allowed the U.S. Air Arm to dictate the terms of engagement for the rest of the conflict, ensuring that the bomber stream was unstoppable not because of its own defensive power, but because the Protector had destroyed the threat at its source. It was this strategic victory that allowed D-Day to proceed with virtually no air opposition, proving that total air dominance was the ultimate prerequisite for ground success, a lesson that would define warfare for decades to come. The question of cheating was answered not by moral debate, but by the cold, harsh reality of aerial control. The side that controls the air always writes the rules of the war below, and the P-51 made the U.S. the definitive author of those rules.